So how do we connect this form as a whole and also these controls to this form and to the input elements in our form here? Well, with help of special directives, which we add to some of these elements. Now, to unlock these directives, we first of all must import something here though, since I'm in a standalone component still. And that something is now the reactive forms module. Before, with the template-driven forms approach, it was the forms module. Now it's the reactive forms module, which is required if you're working with, you guessed it, reactive forms. With that import added here, you can go to your component, and there you can now, for example, go to this email input and add the form control directive. And we can now dynamically bind that with the property binding syntax to our form property. So to our form, which we created in our code here. And then in there to our controls and there the email control. This would now link this input to this email control here. Now writing down the full path to the control like this can be a bit cumbersome though. That's why I will do it here so that you see this approach, but that's why Angular also gives you a shorter way, a shortcut you could say. Because besides the form control directive, there also is a form control name directive. And here you then just specify the name of the control inside of your form to which you want to link this input. So here in case of the password input, I want to link it to this control, which has a name of password. So your property name is the name which you use as a value for your form control name directive, like this. Now with that, I'm trying to link those inputs, but as you see, I'm getting an error if I try to run this. Because Angular in the end here is not able to find a control with my form control name. So with a form control name of password, because the overall form isn't connected to this form. So that's therefore also something we must do, and we do that by binding the form group directive here. Because a form, as you see, is just a form group. So we use the form group directive on this form element, and I'm using property binding to bind it to my form property, which I set up in my TypeScript class. And with that, the overall form is now connected and its controls are connected to their input elements as well. So therefore, as you can tell, we still have to do some work in the template, but in the end, we're just linking elements here. We're just connecting elements. The form setup work was done here in the TypeScript code. Well, and with that, we can now save this again. The error is gone, and we can move on to handling the form submission, the form validation, and a couple of other things as well. So let's start with handling the form submission. I already got an onSubmit method, but this should now get triggered when the form is submitted. And handling the submission works just as it does with template-driven forms. You can listen to the special ng-submit event, that doesn't change, and you can then call whatever method you want to call here. What's different compared to the template-driven approach, though, is that you don't need to pass any argument to onSubmit because you already have access to the form in your class because it was set up and created there after all. So here in onSubmit, we can simply console log this form to look into it and get an idea of which kind of information we can extract from there. So if I save that, and then I enter something here, let's say, and I click login, you see the form group is logged, and in the end, it's the same kind of form group object we dealt with before. Because under the hood, Angular manages these forms in the same way, it's just the setup work that differs in the end. But we still got our pristine property, the status property, the value property, which represents the shape of our form and holds the values of our inputs, of our controls. We got the controls object, which allows us to extract more information about the email or password controls, like whether it's pristine or valid, and so on. And that, therefore, all works as before in the end. But we actually still have a nice extra benefit in our TypeScript code compared to the template-driven approach, because we got better TypeScript support here. Because TypeScript understands the shape of our form now, and therefore we can now, for example, access controls.email. Because TypeScript knows that we registered an email control. We can access this.form.value.email, and that's the kind of TypeScript support we did not get before when using template-driven forms. Their value would be of type any, because TypeScript wouldn't know which kind of controls we have. But here, getting the entered email and the entered password is super easy and type safe because we're using this reactive forms approach. And therefore, of course, I can console log both pieces of information here if I want to, like this. With that, again, if we enter our information here and click log in, you see that output here. And that's how we can handle the form submission and get hold of the entered values. But what about validation when working with reactive forms? So how can we make sure that these inputs here are validated by Angular? Now, when using the template-driven approach, we ensured validation by adding attributes or directives in the end, like required, to our input elements. When using the reactive forms approach, we don't do that. Instead, the idea really is that we set up everything in our code, in our TypeScript code. And therefore, you add validators to form controls here when you create those controls. Though you could also add validators later by accessing the form, and then you could access a control like the email control and call add validators, if you needed to add more dynamically at some point in the future. This is a more advanced use case though. Instead, in most cases, you probably want to add validators when the form is being created, and you can easily do that by adding a second argument to your form control constructor here. And that second argument could be an array of validators, and I'll show you what a validator looks like in just a second. But it can alternatively also be a configuration object, which is the approach I'll use here since it's a bit more descriptive. Because this configuration object now, for example, takes a validators key to register this array of validators. And I think that's simply a bit easier to read and understand. Now you could also add async validators, and I'll get back to that. You could make sure that this input can't be set to null again if it were reset. And you can also control if the value managed by Angular should update on every keystroke or only if the input loses focus with update on. But here I only care about the validators. And a validator, in the end, is a function, you could say. And we will later also build our own validator in this section here. For the moment, we'll use a built-in validator instead. And we can do that by using the validators object, which is imported from @AngularForms. So this import must be added. And this validators object here, this class in the end, then has some validators it exposes. Like, for example, the email validator for this email control. And this will ensure that Angular checks whether a valid email address has been entered here. In addition, we can use the required validator to make sure that it's not empty. And for the password, I'll also register validators, and there I want to make sure that it is required and that it has a min length of 6 characters. And of course, you can play around with the other validators here as well. And as I mentioned, we'll also create our own validator function later. For the moment, these are the validators I want to add here. With those added, Angular will keep track of the control validity status and the overall form validity status, just as it did before with the template-driven approach. Therefore, we can of course also output an error message if invalid values have been entered. So we can add this if check again and now use our form and there the controls and check if email was touched and if form controls email is dirty. So if the user did also enter at least one character, and if form controls email is invalid. And if all these conditions here are met, we can output this paragraph with a CSS class of control-error, where we could say, please enter a valid email address or something like that. Now, of course, this here is quite a lot of code to write. So therefore, what you would often do is grab that and add a getter to your login component. Email is invalid, could be the getter name, and then there I would return this form controls email touched, this form controls email dirty, and this form controls email invalid. And with that, I outsourced this check here into this getter, and in the login component, I can use this email is invalid getter property in my if check now. We can also duplicate this getter now and set up a getter for the password and check if this form controls password is touched and dirty and invalid. And with that added, back in the template, we can duplicate this if check and this error paragraph and use our password is invalid getter to output, please enter a valid password at least 6 characters long. With that, this is all updated. And if we go back now, you'll see initially I see no error message and no error styling. But if I tap into here, type at least 1 character and go out of here, you see now it's marked as invalid from a styling perspective. And we have this error message. And we got this error styling here because just as before, Angular adds these special classes to these inputs. So that works just as before with the template-driven approach. And hence here, I can now, of course, also enter a valid email address. And for the password, I also got some validation going on. So that's therefore all looking good and working the way it should. Now with help of validators that are added by using this reactive forms approach.